Welcome, everybody. My name is Carly Conklin, and I'm the moderator of today's panel from the section of Alternative Dispute Resolution. We're taking a look at the question, effective Twitter advocacy, is it possible? And we've got a great lineup of speakers today. As our panel description highlighted, we are looking at the concept that substantive debates about law and policy are increasingly happening on social media platforms like Twitter. If the purpose of legal scholarship is to share our ideas beyond academia, then the question is, how might we do that more effectively? We're interested in questions like how we might turn the challenges of Twitter, including character limits and speed of transmission, into advantages for engaging a broader audience. We're looking at how we might apply the tools of dispute resolution to overcome issues such as lack of trust and adherence to positions and negative identities that are so prevalent on social media. We're hoping to find ways together to contribute to these discussions in ways that are concise, content-rich, candid, and compelling. Each of our panelists today will speak for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. After that, we will open it up to Q&A. So I hope that you will please feel free to submit your questions through chat, and I'll be pulling a variety of questions out that go across the content of the panel for us to address in the final portions of our discussion. Our first panelist today will be Carissa Byrne-Hessick, who's a distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill School of Law. Carissa will share from her work on academic norms for law professors on Twitter. Our second panelist will be Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan is professor and associate director of the Institute for Dispute Resolution at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. He will share from his work on negative identity and conflict resolution and its implications for online discourse. Our third panelist will be Noam Ebner. Noam is professor of negotiation and conflict resolution at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Creighton University. He will share on his work on the role of trust in conflict. And then finally, our fourth panelist is Lauren Newell. Lauren is professor of law and associate dean for academic affairs at Ohio Northern University Pettit College of Law. She will share from her work on empathy in the digital age. With that, Carissa, I hand it to you to kick off our panel.
Thanks so much, Carly, and thank you for including me. I'm not an ADR person. In fact, I'm a criminal law professor at the University of North Carolina, and I actually spend a lot of my research talking about how there is too much negotiation in the criminal law. So I'm excited actually to learn from people who advocate and who have a background in getting people together in order to reach better resolutions, because that's just not my area of expertise. While I don't have a lot to say about that topic, I do have a lot to say about Twitter. And I talk about Twitter a lot on Twitter. I've talked about Twitter at several academic conferences. I've even written a law review article about Twitter. It's a little bit of a strange niche to have. But I talk about Twitter a lot because I actually really like Twitter. I mean, I'm a little bit conflicted about it, but I really think that Twitter is a net positive. I think that the platform, its benefits outweigh its drawbacks. And I think specifically for law professors, there's a lot of value in being on Twitter. It allows us to get our ideas out to each other and to broader audiences as well. I mean, some of the traditional formats that we have for disseminating our ideas are really slow. They're pretty specialized. They're only going to reach a limited audience. And I know that I've been able to learn from some of my colleagues on Twitter more than I would have if I just stuck to reading scholarship, going to conferences, even reading blogs. I'm not sure we really have a lot of blogs anymore, because people tend to be so siloed. But Twitter, perhaps because tweets have to be so short, allows people to consume a lot of ideas very quickly from a wide variety of people. And so I think as law professors, where a big part of what we do is to think critically about ideas and to offer our own opinions and analysis, being able to reach a broader platform with that is really valuable. In addition to being able to get our ideas out there and to get them out there quickly while they might still be relevant to an ongoing discussion, it also allows us to build a professional network. I've met other law professors and lawyers on Twitter that I might not have otherwise met. In fact, when I was writing a book recently on plea bargaining, I ended up being able to conduct interviews with people that I had met through Twitter that I probably otherwise wouldn't have been sort of brave enough or had enough of a connection with to ask them to sit for the interviews instead. That's been really, really valuable. But I'll also say, and this is maybe going to sound a little bit crass or a little bit strategic, overly strategic. I think Twitter is really good for people's professional opportunities and reputation. I think law professors, I think it offers an opportunity for law professors to increase their own profile in ways that we often don't necessarily have control over. I guess if I were like a criminal law professor at Harvard Law School, the Washington Post would want to call me and ask me on my take about the day, but that's not where I am. And so that's not traditionally what happens. But reporters do search Twitter when they're writing stories. And I've gotten media calls off of Twitter because I tweeted about something. In addition to getting media calls, I even gotten some funding for my research from some external foundations because folks affiliated with those foundations saw tweets that I had written about the research that I was doing, and they thought it was valuable research, which, yes, I'm very excited about that. And now I can do the research more quickly with like a small army of research assistants instead of just, me. And then when I wanted to write this book about plea bargaining and I wanted to have it published by a popular press, I went out and I got an agent, and the agent was willing to take me on and actually sold the book manuscript. He was very explicit about this, in part because of the number of Twitter followers I have. And it's not even a particularly large number if you look at some of these accounts for some of our colleagues across the country. But from their perspective, I had what they call a platform, which is to say, by doing this work, I had built up an area and a place where I could share opinions, and more people than otherwise would have will listen. And so it's created these really tremendous opportunities for me that I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful for. But even though I think that Twitter is a net positive, there are clearly drawbacks to the platform. And I think some of those drawbacks are things that we as law professors need to be particularly cognizant of. One is just that some people are mean and rude and kind of awful, at least in their interactions online. So just be aware of that. The mute button is there for a reason. You don't have to listen to terrible things that people want to say. But in addition to sort of that general negativity, I'd also say that I think that there can be a danger on this platform for people who want to be on the platforms as a professional. And just to be very clear here, when I say be on the platform as a professional, it sounds much more formal than what it means. It means have a Twitter account in which you identify yourself as a law professor. I think when we do that, we're conveying something to the people who read our tweets. We're saying, I'm a professional in the legal field. And so therefore, I think we need to think about what that means and what sort of rules of professionalism we should worry about. Some of them I think are pretty obvious. If you're out there tweeting as yourself and as a law professor, you probably should care about tweeting terrible things that would reflect really badly on you as a person, right? If you decide to become a huge internet troll, that's probably not a good idea. And now people know where you work. But more broadly than that, I think when we're tweeting as law professors, there are certain implicit claims that we're making. Now, let's be clear. The claim we're not making, and this is the one that everyone seems to always try to guard against, is I'm on Twitter as a law professor at the University of North Carolina. And then sometimes people will be like, the views are just my own. Of course they're my own. I'm not tweeting on behalf of my employer. That would give my dean a heart attack, among other things. But I don't think anyone thinks that there are official views of the University of North Carolina that someone's being, communicating in a Twitter account. I'm not even sure that there are official views of the University of North Carolina that extend beyond like the Duke basketball team. So that's not what I mean. What I mean is I'm representing myself as someone who's part of a particular profession. And in some ways, I'm claiming the credibility that comes with that profession. And so I think all of us who want that credibility should be concerned about whether that label comes with credibility or how other people have used the label in a way that might damage the credibility. And so this is where I find myself thinking about academic norms, right? What are the sorts of things that we should expect from ourselves and expect from each other as we engage in this very public platform that's readily accessible, in which we want people to take us seriously and to frankly think well of us if we're representing ourselves as law professors? What should that mean? Well, the first thing that I'd say is, although I'm not claiming to represent the University of North Carolina, I am claiming expertise. I think that's implicit in the claim of being on Twitter. As a law professor, I'm claiming legal expertise. And especially because the platform doesn't give us a lot of space to fully articulate our analysis, we're often making conclusory claims, and I'm relying on my status as a law professor to give weight to those claims. So I think we need to be careful when we're doing that, right? I think we're implicitly claiming expertise when we tweet about legal things, and sometimes we frankly don't have that expertise. Sometimes we're tweeting about things that are well outside of our fields, and I think we need to be careful about that because I don't think that the public necessarily distinguishes between different fields. Sometimes we're tweeting about things within our fields without having done sufficient research to be able to back that up. And we might say something that's misleading. And I've seen that happen quite often, frankly. It matters because those things get picked up. They get picked up by the media. Like, I don't know when this started, but there are publications out there that that includes screenshots of people's tweets as if it's expert commentary. So instead of getting a media call, sometimes what you get is you get your tweet screenshotted in an article in a national media organization. And if you got that wrong, that's super embarrassing. And it should be just as embarrassing as like saying something wrong in the media call and then getting quoted. So I think we need to be careful. And I should add, like, I don't think we're careful enough. And by we, I'm including myself in that. I mean, a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court granted cert in a case that I thought was interesting, that was in my field, but I had not done a ton of work on. And I tweeted something substantive about that case, and it got screenshotted and included in an article. And I was panicked. And I sat down and I did all of the research, and I ended up writing a law review article, in part because I felt as though I had to justify the thing that I tweeted, that when I tweeted it, I was like 75% sure that it was right. But then I was super worried. What if I was wrong? And if I was wrong, shouldn't I don't know, say something and make that clear? I mean, just despite that lesson, it happens even now. Last night I tweeted something about the fact that one of the people who'd stormed the Capitol, who was shot and killed, that was going to increase the criminal penalties that the people who stormed the Capitol were facing. I made that comment with my general background knowledge of criminal law, and I got a media call. They're like, really? What? And I had to sit down and do the work. And like, I was pretty sure I was right. And I, by the way, was right, but not for the reasons that I thought. So like, I'm really lucky that I didn't tweet something more specific that I thought was right that was actually wrong. So the problem is, in some sense, that the media platform contributes to this, right? It encourages us to tweet things because it's exciting, it's newsworthy. We get this feedback with retweets and likes, and people talk to us. And I just think we need to be very conscious of what we're doing. So if you don't know things for sure, say that, couch it that way. You could say, I think maybe blah, 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 or couch things as a question or disclaim expertise, right? This happened. I was tweeting with somebody about the double jeopardy clause, and I said, it's been a while since I've looked at the double jeopardy cases, but isn't XYZ true? And you know what? It totally wasn't. So thank God I put that down as a question. I looked like less of an idiot because of it. And I also didn't mislead anybody because folks in the comments were able to tell me I was wrong. So worry about the implicit claim of expertise. Let that shape how you tweet, what you tweet, but also how you tweet. And then the last thing I'd say is, I think it's important to remember that one of the things we do as law professors is we teach our students how to have reasoned debates. And I think we should model that on the platform. I think it's too easy to devolve into ad hominem attacks. I think it's too easy to make fun of people and say things that cut off debate. I think there's probably just not enough reasoned debate in the world. And since we teach that in our classroom, wouldn't it be great if we taught it to a broader number of people? Again, I've certainly fallen short here, and I always appreciate it when someone sends me like a direct message or says in the comments, like, oh, Carissa, are you being fair here? We should try to do that. We should try to model it. And if we fall short, I think that we should acknowledge it. And just, I don't know, just imagine that our students are probably reading these Twitter feeds. They don't yet have a fully formed opinion about what it means to be part of this profession. And I hope that we can model something really exemplary for them. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. I'm afraid I spoke too long already, and I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say.
Okay, our next panelist today will be Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan will be speaking with us about negative identity and conflict resolution and its implications for online discourse. Jonathan, over to you.
First, let me say thank you to Carly for organizing this panel and for the many people who are involved in putting on a conference like this. I know you just see us up front if you're attending the session, but an awful lot of work goes on behind the scenes, and I appreciate it. The remarks I'm going to give are in part based on a paper that's forthcoming in the Ohio State Journal on dispute resolution of mine on negative identity, what I call negative identity and conflict. So if you want, I'll allude to some things, but if you want to follow up more, that's a place you can look for it. A disclaimer just before I begin, and just to help you understand where I'm coming from. I am not a tweeter. I'm not an expert on tweeting. I'm not an expert on the internet or digital media. A lot of my work instead focuses on the subject of conflict resolution generally. But some of it has been implicated by what's going on in our digital world today. And I hope that some of the ideas that I'm discussing can help inform how we think about that. Also, I'm not thinking from the perspective that Carissa is talking about of a law professor and what does it mean as a law professor to be using Twitter. What I'm thinking about more is, as a society, what does it mean for us to be having more and more of our discourse taking place on a platform like that? Just to go back a big step, the title of our panel dealt with advocacy, and as an ADR person by background, I begin by thinking that advocacy can have many meanings. One concept of advocacy is winning, defeating the other side. You have a courtroom trial and you want to beat them at trial. And that goal of winning, of course, takes place in more than just trial. Another concept of advocacy is advancing your client's interests, and often advancing interests involves listening to other people, engaging in dialogue, and ultimately playing the role of a problem solver rather than a defeater, a warrior, if you will. And one of the main people I think about in terms of her work in that area was Carrie Menkel-Meadow, who for so many years did so much to advance our understanding and thinking about what it means for lawyers to help solve problems in society. And when I think about things like Twitter and social media, part of what goes through my mind is, to what extent do these promote things like listening, dialogue, and problem solving rather than just advocacy, if you will. Okay. With that in mind, I want to set a little background, because I think one of my main concerns is that some of the social media platforms we have exacerbate a phenomenon of what I would call negative identity. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but just a little intellectual history first. In 1999, a linguistics scholar named Deborah Tannen, who's a wonderful scholar, published a book called The Argument Culture. And it was about how dialogue in America, particularly public dialogue, was increasingly shifting from discourse, where people listened to one another, to debate, where they were trying to defeat one another. And she was talking about discourse that had been shifting over the prior 2-3 decades to her writing that book in 1999. The argument that I would make, and when I talk about negative identity, is that we are increasingly living in a world, I fear, where people not only disagree with one another, but often define themselves as not being someone else. And that phenomenon can really contribute to conflict in our world. Just to take it out of the political setting just for a second, if you think of a teenager growing up and you're 14 or something like that, often people in part say to themselves something like, not explicitly, but implicitly, who am I? And if the answer to that question is, I am not my parents, what it means to be me is not to be them, not to be that other person, it's very likely you're going to be in conflict with whomever you defined yourself as not being. And it's maybe a healthy part of teenage growth to go through a phase like that. And hopefully in time, a person defines themselves in positive terms, who I am, rather than I'm not being someone else. But increasingly in our world, particularly in our political world, I believe we see a phenomenon where people and groups define themselves against some enemy. There's some they that that's a threat, that's a bad, that we see as wrongful, and that we define ourselves against. And that can be very easy to do in digital media. This is taking place. Political scientists have studied this, and I would point to the work of Alan Abramowitz and Stephen Webster in American political discourse. And if you ask people from the major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and you explore what they stand for, what you'll find is that over the past 4 decades, so this is pre-Trump, I'm not just talking about the past 4 years, the people are increasingly defining themselves against someone else. So I'll talk about not a political party. What it means to be American is not to be some foreigner, for example, rather than what it means to be American is I'm a member of a democracy, or I hold certain values, or something like that. What it's meant to be a Republican has been to be, I am not a Democrat. And what it means to be a Democrat has increasingly become, I am not a Republican. When you live in a world where that type of phenomenon takes place, conflict resolution gets more difficult, because often what you do is you project onto the other things you don't want to deal with, and you can discount what they're saying and not really deal with dissonant information that's coming your way. So in a case from a conflict resolution perspective, where people are just in normal interaction with one another, often they'll have disagreements, right? And the challenge is, can I listen to the other person? Can I understand what they're saying? Can we come up with some kind of solution? That's from a conflict resolution perspective. Where people hold negative identities, that enterprise becomes increasingly difficult. If what it means to be a white is I am not a black, then, and I've defined myself that way, then for me to really think deeply and to move beyond holding a position like that or construction of myself, I have to in part ask, what has made me the way I am? What is producing me to be the kind of person that I am? Sometimes we'll say things like, we need to understand history and conflict so as not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And that's a very important reason, of course, to study something like history. But another reason is to understand who we are. where did I come from? Why did my group come to hold the values that it holds? Where one often successful formula for constructing a group is to construct it against some external threat, right? And I'm the strongman protector who protects you against an external threat is often a winning recipe for a leader. So when I think of what these social media platforms do in terms of this phenomenon of people increasingly constructing themselves in negative ways, and it's not just things like Twitter, cable selective news information, where people are listening to cable channels that just reinforce their prior beliefs and help them avoid cognitive dissonance, right? That feeds into equations like this. The questions become to me, how do we hold discourse where we first aren't vilifying the other at some very basic level, but also how do we hold discourse in these platforms where we demonstrate listening, where we show other people that we're hearing what they're saying? How do we engage in problem solving in these kind of channels? I'm not inherently against these channels. I'm not saying that these worlds are not my expertise. Just to go back. But from a perspective of conflict resolution, I think those are some of the big questions that arise. How does listening occur via Twitter? How does problem solving occur via Twitter? How does that occur more generally in our society? Twitter may not be the exact mechanism, but how does that occur in those kinds of that digital world? Okay, I'll stop with that, and thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next speaker this afternoon will be Noam Ebner. Noam is going to share from his work on the role of trust in conflict. Noam?
Thank you, Carly, and thank you, everyone. And honestly, my instinctive response here is, no, Jonathan, go on. I want to hear more, as I wanted to say to Carissa. But I know that once I stop speaking, it will be hard for me to stop. So I'm just going to jump ahead. And I'd like to jump in by emulating or replicating what both Jonathan and Carissa did by saying exactly where do we sort of fit in here. So I am on Twitter. I don't have anything near the tribe of followers that Carissa does, but I do dabble in those waters. I do have an ADR background in activity. I am not currently a professor in a law school. I was yesterday, I might be tomorrow, but right now I'm in a conflict resolution program. Some of my best friends are still lawyers. And one point to that is that what I will speak about now might be more general as to not necessarily how can our legal opinions or our policy decisions regarding law, policy suggestions, but rather in a more a broader sense, how are we persuasive on Twitter and in the academic world? How are our academic views or policy recommendations or academic interactions? How are they conducted through Twitter? And the work I've been doing that ties into this is on topics of negotiation, first of all, which is not directly what we're dealing with, but which has, let's call it tie-ins in terms of debate or persuasion. And I won't spend time kind of making that connection, but kind of leave it as take judicial knowledge of it, sort of judicial notice. Can everyone, is my presentation, okay, thumbs up, thank you. And what I'd like to bring together is some things from the work I do, both on conflict, on trust, on negotiation, and on the online world. One of my areas of exploration is online dispute resolution, online negotiation. So I've been living in that area for quite a while. And what I'm going to do now is, rather than bring forth something structured and well thought out, such as the previous speakers did so well. Instead, I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall. We'll see what sticks, and we'll see sort of what feeds into the conversation that I hope will develop afterwards. And I've limited myself to 2, 3 at the most slides from each of these areas, and we'll see what we get when that mix comes together. I'd first like to say something about Twitter. Is that we speak about how can we engage on Twitter as if Twitter is sort of a single communications media. And it really isn't a single medium. It's a medium with all sorts of different channels and all sorts of different ways to use it. And each of those affects how we will use it as academics, whether, one way to use it would be to be passive, as in the upper left corner, we're just receiving. This is the old television model. We just turn on the TV and watch whatever is being broadcasted at us, and that's where we get some of our information. Many people don't engage too much on Twitter. They just receive opinions, news, book recommendations, or conspiracy theories, just by so to speak, watching Twitter, much as we used to consume TV. And that is very different from the upper right corner, in which the tweet bird is tweeting. That's a broadcasting activity, and it's broadcasting not to any specific individual, it's broadcasting to the world. And it's broadcasting to the world. Originally, it broadcasts to those people who are following us, whether it's 1 or 1 million. But since Twitter has the capacity for things to be retweeted onwards to an unknown and nigh infinite audience, including that things could get screenshot and put in a paper, as Carissa mentioned so correctly, this is a broadcasting to the world channel that Twitter offers us. Another mode of communication, the bottom right corner, is that we can have sort of one-on-one conversations with specific individuals, as if I would say, at Carissa, I agree with you 100%, or if you want to have a debate, at Carissa, what are you talking about, right? And she would write back, at Noam Ebner, hey, I think I'm right, and here's why. And we'd be having this talk. Only an interesting aspect of this is that this is a public talk. We're speaking directly to one another. Twitter is going to send us notices that we are receiving messages directly from one another, that Carissa has engaged with me, that I have engaged with her, but still it is public, and everyone who follows Carissa and myself will receive these messages and see them. So this is a private discussion. This is a one-on-one discussion in the public sphere. And finally, in the lower left-hand corner are one-on-one conversations that are private, which can be done in Twitter through direct messaging, which is another function of Twitter. So speaking about Twitter as a thing is a mishmash. And I'm just going to kind of put that out there as one thing to take into consideration. And one reason to do it is because something that communications theory teaches us, a very basic notion in communication theory. I nearly said a very basic notion in conspiracy theory. I wonder what I have on my mind. Is the notion of media effects. Is that when we engage with one another, we're never communicating in a vacuum. It always takes place through a channel. Right now, the channel is called a Zoom platform of one form or another, a video conferencing platform to get less specific. But even when we're in a room together, it is sort of a face-to-face channel. Phone conversations take place over that audio channel. And communications theory explains how every media that we communicate through affects the message. It affects the information that we share, the type of information we share, the way we share it, and the way that we intake it. So Twitter, combining those two notions in communications theory, Twitter just got a whole lot more complex in the sense of each one of those 4 channels on Twitter. If it wasn't mysterious enough, each one of those 4 channels on Twitter affect our communication differently. Okay? Put a pin in that or forget it forever. We'll see if we come back to that later on. I'm going to jump to the notion of trust. Trust is an entire realm of research in its own right. It has deep impact on negotiation and conflict. So I have worked on it in that context. mainly on interpersonal trust, which is often very important for one-on-one conversations, whether they're of a negotiation type or a persuasion type. And here's one possible definition. Trust scholars often argue over definitions of trust until someone remembers to say, hey, trust is a really complex term and we should only define it in a particular context. And that's where people say, oh, right, like we've written that 1,000 times. Let's all back off and stop arguing. So in negotiation, the focus on trust is often on elements of risk, of uncertainty, of expectations. I'm rolling the dice on you cooperating with me, even though I can't force you to. And if I could force you, I wouldn't need to trust you. I could just force you. In other contexts, it might be defined slightly differently. And Carissa mentioned that on Twitter, we present ourselves in different ways and we get different audiences and we engage with them differently and we build up different types of reputation with them, which is why one other type of trust or definition or context of trust I've thrown up here is the notion of brand trust, because one aspect of what we're doing on Twitter is essentially as crass, I think to use Carissa's word, as crass as it seems, is establishing a brand, or that's how people sort of will see us. So another way to look at some Twitter activities through the notion of brand, and therefore that kind of trust might be important also. And again, not getting in depth, throwing stuff on a wall. In our area, when you look at trust, before we jump, in the context of persuasive, a policy or a scholarship debate, what might trust be? I might have a suggestion at the end, or I might leave that open. I haven't seen opinions on what this necessarily is. I have my own idea, but it might be that all five of us in this and all 30, 40 people in the audience all have their own particular view of exactly what it is we mean when we say engaging in a scholarly or policy debate or advancing a view on Twitter. So I'll kind of leave that for later, perhaps. Another aspect of trust is that it doesn't come from one place. And trust forms in different ways. And if we're trying to affect people persuasively on Twitter, and one element of that is, will they trust us? It pays to keep in mind how trust forms. And when we all look at the cute dog, right? The cute dog is carrying a huge stick. And one way that trust forms is, I trust you as far as I can beat you over the head with a stick. Okay, that's called deterrence or calculus-based trust. I trust you as long as it's in my own best interest to trust you. I trust you as long as I consider it to be in your best interest to keep your word. Right? So if I have a stick that's 6 feet long, I will trust someone within 6 feet of me because I can whack them with the stick. If someone is 7 feet away from me, I will not trust. And this is sort of an economist's view on trust. It's also a legalistic view on trust in the sense of this is what punitive damages essentially does. It's, if a contract includes a punitive damages clause of $1 million, then each company who's a party to the contract trusts, quote unquote, the other party to the extent of $1 million and not to the extent of $1 million and one. Others would say that isn't trust, that's a stick, or that's not trust, that's a punishment. And trust is a sort of a warm and fuzzy thing. And indeed, one of the issues with trust, this might tie in, this ties into the notion of empathy as well, as Lauren might discuss later, or not to put any words in your mouth. But there's also this notion, is trust in the head or is trust in the gut? Is it a cognitive issue or an emotional issue? Another form of trust is sort of cognitive, but it comes from a different place. It's, what do I know about the other party? What do I know about the person who's on the other side? And the more I know about them, their habits, their values, their beliefs, the way they act, the way, how they've acted in the past, how they see the world, the more I will know whether to trust them or not in a given situation. And this knowledge of the other person could come from a relationship. Okay, when we are in a long-term relationship with someone, we know them deeply, and that's where this knowledge-based trust evolves from. And sometimes it can come from conducting, we don't know the person, we don't have a relationship, we conduct our research on this person, and we alphabetize everything we know about them, and we contact 30 people, and we cross-index everything, and then we get a good sense for who they are and what they are likely to do in any situation, and we trust them to stay in line with what we know about them. And then a final type of trust is perhaps the most elusive, tricky, and perhaps silly of them all, which is that we tend to trust people the more similar they are to us. Really, the more we see ourselves in them, the more we will trust them. So now you don't have to be identical twins like Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger in order to trust someone. But if when people discover that they went to the same university, so you might say, okay, they tend to trust each other more. It's just a fact of human trust. Now, of course, we know that in University X there are just as many scoundrels and cheaters and liars as there are in any other university in the world. But just the same, we trust them a little bit more. And similarly, we trust people. We're not necessarily aware of this, but buying a car from two used car salespeople, we will buy the same car if we have no reason to trust one or the other from the person who has the same color eyes as we do, from a trust perspective. Silly? Not? Apparently it makes some sense in human evolution. The question of whether it makes sense today is a different question. And the question of how to bring that to the online, as people looking at this from the perspective of people who are trying to get others to trust them to a certain extent, is a really interesting question. How do we form that sense of identification and affiliation online? There's a new source of trust developing in the online world that has to do with interpersonal trust and other types of trust. This is being called crowd trust or peer trust, which is the notion that when you wanted to find a good restaurant 10 years ago, you used to ask a friend, and now you go on Yelp. And for some reason, you believe, Jim 1969 or, Smart Girl 73, that she thinks that this Italian restaurant is really good. And it has 4 stars from 320 people, so it must be okay. And we actually place trust in this to a really crazy extent. Remember, it's not only do we go to this restaurant and the stakes are, I had a steak restaurant in mind. The stakes are, that it won't be as good as we want it to. But that is essentially what's operating when we get into an Uber alone at night with a driver we've never met before and hasn't been vetted or licensed by anybody we necessarily trust. But reviews and ratings fill in that gap and they play a trust role. So this is one of the things about trust and therefore negotiation and debate that is changing. I'm not going to get into this at all, but I will say that in negotiation, trust has been shown to be key for all the good stuff. Okay? Whatever you consider to be the good stuff in negotiation, trust delivers. Trust either delivers it directly or lubricates and facilitates its arriving. So I think that applying this to the notion of being persuasive and engaging with others, even on non-negotiation but persuasive scholarly and policy debates, a lot of it relies on these same mechanisms, and particularly specifically, people tend to think of what do we need to trust for in negotiation? It's that we need the other to trust us that we will deliver on whatever we promise. In other words, the outcome. But that's not what we need them to trust us for in a negotiation process. Honestly, what we need them to trust us is we need them to trust us that we will, engage with them, that we will, when we ask them to invest time in talking with us, we're asking them to roll the dice on maybe we'll just, talk their ears off and then leave. When we ask them to share information, we're asking them to trust us that we won't take that information and stab them in the back with it. We're asking them when they ask us for something and we say no, we're asking them to trust us to know that we are going to continue to consider what they're thinking, what they're asking for, rather than them just getting up and leaving. So in the process of negotiation, we need far more trust than we usually talk about or compared to just this outcome trust. Now, I imagine that the young lady in this picture thinks that outcome trust is really, really important, and I'm not arguing that. Okay, but think about everything, all the practice that went into achieving that jump. There was a lot of trust along the way. And finally, and here I'm going to stop, is that when we communicate via Twitter, we're facing multiple trust diminishing elements. And I was trying to have sort of a reasonable, persuasive, I don't know what the word is anymore for just having a normal conversation. I think it's like been wiped from our mind. What are these kind of conversations that don't jump to extremes in a moment, or that don't kind of other the other person in a moment, tying it into Jonathan's like, I'm not you. So in text-based communication online, this is what we're up against. These are just research-based findings of what happens when we engage with someone, mainly in a negotiation situation, but much of this research has been done in just conversational or in interpersonal engagements. All these exist. And while this research hasn't been done specifically on Twitter, I'd suggest that it relates enough to bring it to Twitter. Now, this bases on sort of what's called lean communication, primarily text-based, primarily short, mainly verbal, where everything is in the words, and between distanced parties, often who don't know each other. And that is what we get. In addition, ever since the internet, the early days of the internet has been pretty much of a bad neighborhood after dark. And even though it sort of improved over the years, and you'd think that over time we would develop that spidey sense that would allow us to we're more familiar in the neighborhood, so we can see that it's not all bad and it's fine, and we know the difference between a safe site and an unsafe site, between a troll and an engager. Our instincts are better, but that's only contextual, and it's only on certain issues, in certain places, or over certain communication media. And there's still this part of all of our minds which approaches anything we do online with a, wait, what? I don't know. And it's funny because that exists even as we're doing really trust-hefty things online, like banking or negotiating or dating, right? But at the same time, there still is this kind of corner of our mind that reminds us, wait, there's something. And both of those exist at once. Specifically, Twitter has been found to be one of the less trusted social media platforms, at least in terms of data security and what happens with my information. So in addition to everything that everybody's heard about Twitter and how fights happen there, and it's just a bunch of trolls or whatever you may have heard or not heard about Twitter, there's also this issue of, am I safe there? Is my identity safe? My personality, the things that I say, the things that I share, what's going to happen to them? And all of this is mixing together into sort of a trust diminishing potpourri, or maybe bouillabaisse is the better term, as we engage over Twitter. And I think that this affects any effort of ours to hold one of these good conversations that we're looking to hold, one of these learning conversations in which we share and promote perhaps our opinion and our thoughts, but it's open and engaging to others. And while I have some specific recommendations, I'm going to wait to hear where we all take this and just hand this off to Lauren.
Okay, our next speaker, as Noam highlighted, is Lauren Newell, and she will be talking about empathy in the digital age. This will be our final speaker. After Lauren's presentation, we'll go into Q&A. I'm monitoring the chat. If you have a question, please feel free to submit. I have others that will kind of pull more from what the panelists have been saying, and I'll also be sharing with you key articles that the panelists have written on their subject areas when we get into the Q&A. So I look forward to seeing you then. Lauren, we're handing it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Carly. Thanks for having me here. And thanks to all my co-panelists. It's been wonderful being here with you. And to all of you in the room, thanks for coming. I'm happy to have virtual coffee with you later. I miss seeing all of you very much. So today I'm going to be talking with you about some empirical research about the relationship between empathy and online activity. And let's see if I can get my screen going. All right. Oops. Hold on. Let's try that again. Okay, there we are. Clearly, I'm a digital maven. All right. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to, I will be ending with some advice about how we can all be more empathic online and strengthen our empathy muscles generally when we're using any kind of social media. And since things have gotten pretty heavy in the last few days, I am going to keep things relatively light. So in that vein, to kick things off, I want to introduce you to someone. So meet Ilaria Baldwin. She is a yoga instructor, a podcaster, an author, a mother of 5. She's Alec Baldwin's wife. She has 890,000 Instagram followers, which is a mind-boggling number to me. And a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, an anonymous Twitter user posted this tweet. So Cursa was talking about, oh no, people are starting to use my tweets and show them up. So I found this, it's been taken down now, but it was in the New York Times, among other places. So this user accused Ilaria of faking a Spanish identity, faking being a Spanish person, faking a Spanish accent. She was actually born Hillary Hayward Thomas, grew up in Massachusetts. Her parents moved to Spain when she was 27. But this tweet went viral, and a bunch of others that followed it. And so major news outlets have been covering the story. The New York Times interviewed her about this. And all of a sudden, all these people who had never heard of Ilaria Baldwin now have an opinion about her. And many of these opinions are negative, and they've been shared all over the internet. So we'll come back to Ilaria towards the end. Before we do that, let's talk about what empathy is and what we know about it in online activity. Empathy is a really hard concept to try to pin down. Researchers don't agree on a single definition for it, which causes some issues I'll talk about more. But it's a complex emotional system that has some affective, emotional, and cognitive components. The way I like to think about it is a tendency to feel and imagine and understand or interpret other people's feelings, perspectives, and nonverbal communications. So it's both affective and cognitive, and there's a lot going on there. There's not a lot of empirical research done on empathy and technology. What there is tends to focus on young people, whom I like to call the digital generation. So in 2011, a team from the University of Michigan, led by Sarah Conrath, did a meta-analysis of data collected from college students who took the Davis Interpersonal Reactivity Index, or IRI. The IRI measures 4 different facets of empathy. And what they did is compare the IRI scores of American college students that were measured in 72 different studies from 1979 to 2009 to see if there was some sort of generational effect. So they wanted to know if different generations of college students scored differently on the various measures of empathy. And they compared the averages from all these different scores on the different subscales. And the biggest things they found were a 48% decrease in the empathic concern means. Empathic concern is a measure of the tendency to feel what other people are feeling. So it's an affective component of empathy. And a 34% decrease in perspective taking means. So perspective taking refers to the people's tendency to imagine other people's points of view. So this is going to be a cognitive component of empathy. And these are considered to be the more central components of empathy. So I won't talk about the other subscales. The biggest decline that they found in these great big decreases came in the latest sampling year. So starting around the year 2000. And that led the authors to suggest that if empathy has been decreasing primarily since the year 2000, it probably has something to do with technology. And they came up with a number of reasons why technology and the use of technology may be driving this empathy decline. All right, not everybody agrees. Here's a counterpoint. We have another study coming out of the Netherlands. They gathered data between 2012 and 2013, and they looked at adolescents 10 to 14 years old, and they followed them over a 1-year period, and they looked to see how their empathy and sympathy changed over time. So here's where some of these definitional challenges I mentioned come into play. This study measured what they called affective empathy, which is having emotions congruent with another person's emotions, cognitive empathy, which is understanding and recognizing other people's emotions, and sympathy, which they define as feeling for another person. So these authors say empathic concern is really just sympathy. So it's not empathy at all. So we have some disagreement there, and that makes things a little messy. What they found was a positive correlation between using social media and both affective and cognitive empathy. So the kids who are using social media more frequently actually improved their ability to share and understand other people's feelings over time. They didn't find any significant impact on sympathy from using social media. So there was no relationship that they found significant relationship between social media usage and changes in concern about other people's distress. From all this, they made a few suggestions. They said, actually, rather than being bad, social media might help adolescents practice some social skills. So they might be good. And if empathic concern is really sympathy, and there's no effect they found on the sympathy measure here, then maybe social media usage doesn't affect kids' sympathy at all. And so the decrease in empathic concern over time that Conrad's team found might have been due to something entirely different and not to social media usage or technology after all. Couple of caveats here. First, these two studies look at different groups, different age groups. So they leave open the possibility, these authors say, that the good stuff they found from social media usage among 10 to 14-year-olds may not carry through to other age groups. So it may be different for the college students that Conrad looked at or older young adults. They could just have a different effect from using social media. Also, this study didn't ask the kids what they do on social media. They just said, do you use any of these 7 major platforms? Yes or no. So maybe doing some things like responding to a Facebook post might impact empathy differently than doing something like watching a video might, but they don't know. So what do we know and what do we not know right now? We don't know very much. There are very, very few empirical studies on technology and empathy. They are correlational, so people are making guesses about what they show or don't show, and they generally focus on young people. So we really don't know much of anything about all the rest of us and what might be happening to us as we use all these platforms. So if you're a Twitter user, I can't tell you if it's frying your brain or making you more or less empathic. And the fact that the authors can't agree on particular definitions of empathy or sympathy or any of these things makes it very difficult to compare between studies and to draw any general conclusions that way. We also don't know, because they looked at different age groups, any takeaways really about specific age groups and whether some might benefit, some might not benefit. There just may be different impacts, and as kids go through their developmental timeline, social media usage may impact them differently, but we really don't know. We also don't know if the type of interactions that people have online matters. It seems intuitively like it should. Like watching TikTok videos of a random stranger probably impacts you differently from responding to a close friend's Facebook post, but we don't know that for sure. And so we don't know what might be good, what might not be good, and we don't know why. Lastly, we don't know really how social media usage impacts empathy, whether it's a positive or negative impact. We don't really know how it does, if it does. And that's important because figuring out the impact can help us figure out what to do next. So if it turns out, wow, being on social media is great for your empathy, well then heck, get all your kids onto social media and let them practice their empathy skills, right? But if it turns out that it's not so good, then how do we mediate that negative impact? But we don't know really anything right now. So since we don't know much of anything, what can we do right now based on just what we know about empathy? How can we learn to be more empathic on social media? Researchers like to talk about empathy as a muscle that you can build and develop. So how can we strengthen our empathy muscles? First, we can be relatively anonymous online. So a lot of platforms, we do say who we really are, but we don't have to, like the Twitter user who outed, if you want to say it, outed Ilaria Baldwin. It's very easy for us to be mean or rude to someone we haven't met, who isn't in the room standing with us, who won't know that we're the ones being mean or rude. So the first step is really to keep in mind that there's a person sitting behind that screen name, and the person has some feelings. And before we respond to someone's post, we should think about the fact that, as I believe, as Noah mentioned, it's almost the same as talking to somebody, except we're doing it in a written and really, really public way. So what we say is going to reflect both upon that other person and about us. And we should think about that and start by remembering that there's a real person there with whom we're communicating. As someone else also mentioned, I'm sorry, I forgot who did, our social media worlds are often just echo chambers of things we already agree with. So the computer algorithms, they know what we're interested in. They feed us more stuff that we're already interested in. So they suggest we read more of the same things, and we continue to do that. But to be more empathic, we should probably start reading things that we don't agree with. So if your Facebook friend is in one political party and you are in another, maybe rather than muting that person, I know there are a number of people who started muting people during election season and whatnot, maybe rather than muting your friends, you should start reading what they say and just expose yourself to a different viewpoint, because that exposure can help us be more empathic. As we're reading things and we're exposing ourselves to things, we should try to see if we can read for emotion. Right? This is a very cognitive exercise, actually reading the text and trying to identify the feelings that might be underneath the text that we're reading. It's a very good thing to do when we have a strong emotional reaction to what we're reading. It makes us take a step back. It makes us slow down. Analyzing the statement for emotions can engage those cognitive processes and kind of tamp down our emotional processes, help us calm down in the moment. And trying to figure out the emotions behind the written words, it's almost a little like noticing somebody's body language or somebody's facial expressions when we're in the room with that person. It makes our communication a little bit richer, and that's all good for our empathic skills. It makes it less of a lean medium. Next, and relatedly, we want to cultivate curiosity about other people and about their beliefs and experiences. A lot of the time that we're reading things on social media, we're reading about hot button issues, and it's very easy to say, you wrote that, therefore you're bad. Now, some people are bad, but not everybody is bad. Not everyone who disagrees with me is a bad person, and that's the cause of the disagreement. So we should try to see if we can imagine some genuinely believed, not evil reason why someone might have reached the opposite conclusion from our own, and try to be curious about how other people got where they are and where they're coming from. Lastly, every time we post something online, and this feeds back to something Carissa was saying, we're putting a bit of ourselves out there. So whether we're putting our legal reputations out there or we're putting some personal information out there, we're putting ourselves out there. And we should think about whether we have an opportunity to invite other people to empathize more with us. So if we have a really terrible day, we could post a picture of a great big old glass of wine and say, I really need one of these today, and leave it at that. So that's a very surface level thing to do. It doesn't invite a lot of empathy. Alternatively, we could write, wow, today I messed up at work, snapped at my kid, yelled at my husband. Anybody else have a day like that? Writing all that makes us a lot more vulnerable. So we should think about whether this is the online persona we want to have and whether we want to share that much of ourselves online. But the upside to sharing more that way is that it is inviting other people to empathize with us. So not only can they strengthen their empathy muscles by engaging with us in this more meaningful, real way. But it also could get us some support and help us feel better too. So with all this, let's turn back to Ilaria. Okay. So here's what she posted on Instagram in response to all this online chatter about her heritage. So just skimming through a little bit here, she said, we celebrate 2 different cultures in our home. That's just the way I was raised. This is all very important to me. And my story's a little different. It's mine. I'm very proud of it. Okay. So going through the suggestions I just gave, let's see if we can do that. Let's start by thinking about her as a human. So this all broke right around the Christmas holiday. She was just going about her day when somebody suddenly publicly decided to challenge her identity. Supposedly the Twitter user did it because the person was bored and said, this is sort of a everybody knows it, so let's just talk about it. I'm bored. It's a pandemic. I have nothing else to do. So she's going about her day and somebody starts saying, you're not really Spanish, and stop pretending that you are. Okay. Now she's got 5 kids. She is a 3-month-old. It's right around the holidays. Maybe it's a stressful time for her just in her life as a person. What emotions can we see here in this post? Maybe we can see some defensiveness. Maybe we can see some pride. Maybe we can see some other things. Maybe you see something else. Can we be curious about her intentions and her experiences? Now, she grew up vacationing in Spain. She's got close family who live there. She does speak Spanish. Can we imagine she feels a really close personal connection to Spain and to Spanish culture and feels a part of that? How might that shape the way that she presents herself publicly? Doing all of this has just made us a teeny bit more empathic. And it would be a pretty powerful experience if we did this more often when we were online. So the takeaway from all this is that if we really want to cultivate empathy online and be empathic online, we probably want to behave more as if we were interacting with other people offline. So in other words, we should tweet other people the way we would want to be tweeted. So thanks very much. I'll turn it back to Carly.
Okay. All right, we're ready now for the Q&A portion. I see some that are coming in through chat. We're going to do a couple of things here. First of all, I'm going to be sending out to you all current and upcoming publications from each of our panelists on the topics they discussed today. You'll see those coming out through the chat, the titles and the links. And then we're going to start posing questions that came through to our panelists. So our first question that came through was on the role of the trustworthiness of the institution. And the question here is, does the trustworthiness of the institution make the speaker more or less trustworthy? Noam, you did address some of that actually after the question came through, but I think it goes a little bit to questions and issues that both you and actually it goes to things that came up with all of the panelists. So knowing that if there's a trustworthiness boost or diminishment because of the institutions such as Twitter, how might we navigate that in contributing on these forums?
I'll just relate to that briefly, and then I'd be interested in seeing if other people have ideas on it. I'm going to leave it at I strongly believe, because research on this is sparse, that different types of trust or different areas of trust spill over into one another. Okay, so in that sense, someone's sort of inherent trust or relationship with the gravitas of the environment in which a certain conversation is being conducted will spill over to their trust assessment of the people who are having the conversation. And the same goes for if we have sort of inherent distrust of the internet, or if we have an inherent distrust that's related to email, just as an example, as a medium, that will spill over to the interpersonal trust that is going on. So yes, I would say that I think that there is a difference in terms of kind of this intuitive trustworthiness of everything in conversations that take place over Twitter, which is one reason, as Carissa said, to sort of label yourself both in your profile information, but also sometimes, whether in whatever it is, to point to point to things you've done or things you've written or, as appropriate in order to remind, I'm not just some rando on the internet who was bored and posted something in a pandemic. I thought about this stuff because it's important to know, yes, these distrusts spill over, and the sort of natural trustworthiness we feel when we step into a courtroom and speak before a judge and feel that maybe the judge is going to give us the benefit of a doubt, and maybe even the other attorney is going to listen to us. We don't have that. We're in a far more Wild West type atmosphere, so we have to work harder at trust. Absolutely.
Other panelists, anybody want to jump in? We'll go on then to our next question that came through, which is this. What do you think, and this goes to everybody, what do you think of the platform's built-in tools for users? Muting, blocking, reporting tweets, etc. And for Twitter, labeling tweets as inaccurate, suspending accounts in the context of negative identity, trust, empathy, and the broader dispute resolutions we've discussed today.
So I'll just say as a consumer of Twitter, I think that the mute gut button can be very beneficial to your experience. One of the benefits of the platform is that you can comment on what other people have said and let your opinion be known, but it's a two-way street. They can comment on what you've said and let their opinion be known. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of the platform. You can hear from people you otherwise might not hear from, including non-law professors who have thoughts on what's going on, people who have, expertise that you don't, people who even just make you think about something differently. But there are people who use the platform just to be rude and nasty. And I personally found that while I would like to think that I can just let that roll off my back, it actually makes me unhappy, and it affected the way I was interacting with people on the platform and in real life. It was making me kind of rude and nasty. So I just mute them, and I found that it made my experience much, much more pleasant, and it made not just me feel better and like not have my feelings hurt because someone's swearing at me and saying awful things, but then it turned the platform into a more substantive place by filtering out the people who are not just not being substantive, but are really sort of making the place seem as though it's anti-substance.
And you all might not have been able to see that. We have some nods that were going on within the other panelists on that. Would others of you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between muting someone in Carissa's case who's just evil ad hominem attack kind of thing, and muting someone because, oh, you have this different viewpoint from mine and I don't like your viewpoint, so I'm just going to get rid of you. So I know that during all these times, I've been trying really hard to read two ideologically opposed newspapers, and I'm struck so much by the different worldviews that they have. And if you only read one of them, it's sometimes hard to believe that somebody else could think differently. So it's really illuminating reading both of them. But because the platforms let us basically get rid of that, and Facebook will say, oh, let's see more from this friend. You like that type of post. Let me show you more of that. So it's very easy to get into the mind space of, I think this way, everyone else thinks this way, and I'm really right, and everyone else is really wrong. And that's not a good way to have a learning conversation, a sharing conversation, an empathic conversation, to build trust, to build togetherness. So I think they do have, those functions certainly have their place because there are just a lot of trolls out there, but we might want to think carefully about how we use them.
Yeah, Noam?
I'd just like to comment that there really are, not just what we might think of as Twitter trolls, people who get on and just, take over our space and say stuff. There are academic trolls, okay? There are lawyer trolls, there are mediator trolls who are very strongly opinionated people who might, share a profession with us, one profession or another. But the way they express themselves goes beyond engaging and and goes over to either trying to take over the space, shutting us up, or ridiculing us, and they might easily be just as credentialed as us. But trolling is not it's not a credential. Trolling is a behavior, and the more you use Twitter or any social media, but Twitter for now, the better you get at recognizing sort of earlier on in a debate. And it's always, each time you engage with a troll or you recognize a troll, it'll be sort of one post earlier in the chain. And you start recognizing the language and the thinking and the traps and the baiting a little earlier each time. And then you learn either to just disengage because, trolls hate silence, or to mute. And so you just get better at recognizing that. The fact that someone, might be a professor in another law school or might be an experienced mediator if you're posting about ADR doesn't necessarily mean that they are not trolls. So you get better at using those controls. I'll also say to shift to another control. One control that I found I think is very helpful for trust is the ability to thread messages in Twitter. And this allows you to do a bit of what is the message you want to project? So research on text-based messaging shows that a lot of misunderstandings which foster negative attribution, which foster distrust, come as a result of long, vague messages. And in that sense, the requirement to be short and pithy and succinct can be a benefit of the medium. So when you have something to say and it's a single point, Twitter actually helps you with that. However, when you have a complex idea that you want to set forward, Twitter really isn't, or the individual tweet really is not a good message for that, because there is very little room for nuance. Twitter has a control that allows you to thread tweets. I have it on a slide, I can show it, but the slides are available, I think, to participants. I point at it in one of the slides. And then it allows you to write, one thought in one tweet, and to push a button and then add on your second developing thought in a second tweet, your third developing thought in a third tweet, and then you send it all out together, and readers or your followers, whoever they retweet it to, they see them in sequence. And that allows you to kind of overcome the 280 character limit, and it also kind of makes you think about, how do I want to craft my message in a way that will draw people in and listen to me till the end and consider what I'm saying. So if I draw them in, and if I say something right in my second message, so I'm building trust by speaking to them. And if I unmask myself, say something about myself, and build identification-based trust in a third message, then I can develop a few zingers in fourth and fifth and sixth, and there's trust built, and also they're able to listen to nuance. So that's a feature I'd suggest people using Twitter for these, the very nuanced and complex ideas we're trying to get across. Familiarize yourself and practice with that.
No, thank you. A lot of what our last two questions ended up addressing were some of the practical tips and realities of how to foster listening, speaking, and reasoned discourse on Twitter. It is my hunch that we have so much more that we could talk about on that. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I urge you to take a look in our group chat. We've got additional publications, current and forthcoming, from our panelists that go more in depth into each of the topics they've shared with us about today. To each of our panelists, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. This has been a fun and enlightening conversation for me, I'm sure for our audience as well. Our audience members, I know you had so many things vying for your attention today at AALS and beyond. Thank you for sharing part of your afternoon with us.